October 11th, 1492. Somewhere in the black middle of the Atlantic, 3 wooden ships are moving through the night as if they are being dragged across the edge of the known world. The Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña creak under the pressure of the sea, their timbers swollen with salt, their ropes stiff with spray, their decks crowded with men who've been awake too long, hungry too often, and afraid for too many days in a row. These ships are not floating palaces of discovery. They're cramped, filthy, exhausted wooden boxes carrying roughly 90 men who smell of sweat. For 33 days they've seen nothing but water, no harbour, no coast, no city of gold, no islands of Asia. Just the same impossible horizon, morning after morning stretching away like a punishment. Some of the sailors whisper prayers into the darkness. Some watch Columbus with suspicion. Some have already begun to imagine what it would feel like to turn the ships around by force, to seize command before this Genoese dreamer gets them all killed in an ocean that might never end. And somewhere deep inside most of them is the same thought. The thought no sailor wants to say too loudly. What if the maps are wrong? What if Columbus is wrong? What if they have sailed so far from the world that there is no way back? Christopher Columbus stands on the deck of the Santa Maria, staring into the dark, searching for anything that might save him from failure. A bird, a floating branch, a change in the colour of the water, a smell in the wind, any sign that land is close. He needs land now, not in a week, not after another desperate promise, but now, because his crew is reaching the end of belief. The riches of Asia, the courts of the great Khan, the golden islands he promised would lie across the western sea, all of it is beginning to feel less like prophecy and more like madness. And here is the first thing you need to understand. Columbus has already been lying. Not about one small detail, not about some innocent mistake in a sailor's log, but about the distance itself. He has been keeping 2 records, one that shows how far the ships have really travelled, and another, smaller, safer version meant for the crew, because if the men knew the truth, if they understood just how far they had sailed from any known land, the mutiny might already have happened. Nobody aboard those ships understands what's waiting for them. Not Columbus, not his captains, not the frightened men gripping wet ropes in the dark. They think they're approaching the outer edges of Asia. They think Japan, China, spices, silk, gold and royal glory might be somewhere beyond the next line of waves. They are wrong. In only a few hours, a lookout named Rodrigo de Triana will see a pale shape in the moonlight, a white cliff or beach shining against the darkness, and the cry of land will travel across the water from ship to ship. In only a few hours, 2 halves of the planet that have been separated for thousands of years will touch. And after that, nothing will remain untouched. But the story you were probably taught about that morning, October 12th, 1492, is not really the story. It is the polished version, the classroom version, the version where a brave explorer sails west, discovers a new world, and opens the door to progress, civilization, maps, trade, and history itself. It is a story cleaned so many times that the blood, the smell, the confusion, the theft, and the terror have almost disappeared from it. The real story is stranger. It is darker, and it is far more disturbing than the myth. What if Columbus did not understand what he had found, not that morning, not later, not even at the end of his life? What if the discovery was not a discovery at all, but a catastrophic misunderstanding between 2 worlds, each one completely unreadable to the other? What if the most important consequences of that landing were not the things Columbus planned, Not the gold he chased, not the titles he demanded, not the flags he planted, but invisible forces moving inside bodies, barrels, animals, seeds, and breath. What if the real army that crossed the Atlantic was not only men with swords, but microbes, crops, hooves, hunger, and a legal imagination that could turn someone else's homeland into property with a flag and a sentence? If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly what this journey is made for. So maybe subscribe, and if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there, because it is always strange and beautiful to imagine people in Singapore, at sunrise, in Seattle after midnight, in Sao Paulo before dawn, all drifting through the same piece of history. Tonight we're going back to 1492, but not the version with clean paintings, heroic poses and simple answers. We're going into the real texture of that moment. The sour air inside the ships, the hunger in the crew, the desperate need for gold, the first impossible sight of land, the first smiles exchanged between people who could not understand each other, and the first mistakes that would echo for centuries. We're going to meet the Taíno, the people already living across the Caribbean, people with villages, leaders, spiritual systems, trade routes, agriculture, memory, humour, fear, skill, and a world that did not need Europe in order to be complete. We're going to follow Columbus as certainty becomes obsession, as mistake becomes policy, as a search for Asia becomes something much uglier than exploration. We will watch the first European colony in the Americas rise from the wreckage of the ship and then vanish into fire, silence, and unanswered questions. We will see Columbus return to Spain as a hero, while the tragedy he has opened is only beginning. And then we will step beyond the ships and the flags into something larger, something almost impossible to imagine from the deck of a wooden vessel. The Columbian Exchange, the great biological collision that moved horses, wheat, cattle, and sugar westward, while potatoes, tomatoes, maize, cacao, and perhaps disease moved eastward, and while smallpox, measles, and influenza moved through indigenous communities with a force no army could match. The night of October 11th, 1492, was the last night of a divided world. For more than 10,000 years, the hemispheres had developed apart, each with its own crops, animals, illnesses, technologies, gods, languages, and futures. By morning, that separation would end, and once it ended, the consequences would reach everywhere: Europe, Africa, the Americas, Asia, your kitchen, your language, your maps, your bloodstream, your holidays, even the way history itself is remembered. So settle in. The sea is dark, the ships are tired, the men are waiting for dawn, and we are about to sail into one of the most consequential mornings in human history, not because Columbus was simply a hero or simply a monster, but because the collision he triggered still moves beneath the surface of the modern world. Every time you eat a tomato, taste chocolate, hear the word hurricane, see a horse on American soil, speak a European language in the Americas, or look at a map divided by borders that did not exist before 1492, you are living in the long aftermath of that night. But before we can understand what happened in the Caribbean, we have to understand the world Columbus sailed away from. Because Europe in 1492 was not the clean, confident, enlightened place people often imagine. It was a continent still breathing through the wounds of plague, war, hunger, religious violence, and economic desperation. It was a place where the old medieval order was cracking, where kings wanted money, merchants wanted roots, priests wanted souls, and ambitious men like Columbus could sell impossible dreams because everyone around them needed something. Picture Europe in the late 15th century, not as a Renaissance painting glowing with marble and music, but as a lived place, crowded, loud, diseased, and often foul. Start with the smell. Cities reeked of human waste, animal manure, rotting scraps, open drains, tanneries, dye works, smoke, sweat, and damp stone. The Black Death had killed perhaps a third, perhaps half, of Europe's population only a century and a half earlier, and in many places the scars were still visible. Villages had been abandoned. Fields had gone back to brush and forest. Churches stood with fewer worshippers than they'd been built to hold. Families still carried the memory of entire bloodlines cut short. The plague had not only killed people, it had broken systems. Before it, labour had been cheap because there were too many peasants and too few choices. After it, survivors suddenly mattered more. Workers could demand wages. Peasants could move. Lords could feel old privileges weakening beneath their feet. The social order that had once seemed fixed by God and inheritance began to loosen, and whenever old power feels itself slipping, it rarely responds with calm wisdom. It reaches for punishment, for control, for law, for fire. Spain in 1492 stood at the centre of this dangerous energy. In January of that year, Ferdinand and Isabella completed the conquest of Granada, ending the last Muslim-ruled kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula after centuries of Christian warfare. To them, it was a sacred victory, a political triumph, a unifying moment. But what happens to a kingdom that has organised itself around holy war when the enemy it has defined itself against finally falls? What do you do with armies, priests, nobles, and a population trained to think in terms of purity and conquest? You find another target. Only months after Granada fell, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, ordering Jews who refused conversion to leave their kingdoms. Families who had lived there for generations were forced to abandon homes, businesses, synagogues, books, workshops, and memories. This was cruelty, but it was also policy. The monarchs wanted religious uniformity, and they also wanted money. War had drained their treasury, and confiscated property could help fill it again. So when Columbus came to them with a proposal to reach Asia by sailing west, he was not speaking into a peaceful court of dreamers. He was speaking into a hungry political machine, and Asia mattered because Asia meant wealth. Spices were not minor luxuries. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and other goods from the East could preserve food, flavour meat, make medicine, signal status, and create fortunes so enormous that merchants could rival princes. But the routes to those spices were complex, expensive, and controlled by layers of middlemen, Asian traders, Muslim merchants, Venetian and Genoese networks, and ports that took profit at every stage. By the time a spice reached a table in Europe, its price could be many times higher than where it began. European kings were obsessed with breaking that system. Portugal had spent decades pushing south along the coast of Africa, mapping winds, currents, capes, and harbours, slowly building a route around the continent toward India. Spain, newly unified and newly ambitious, did not want to be left behind. And into this atmosphere stepped Christopher Columbus, born Cristoforo Colombo in Genoa around 1451. Not a nobleman, not a prince, not a scholar of royal blood, but the son of a wool weaver, a man from a world of labour and trade, who went to sea young and learned enough about winds, currents, ships, and human persuasion to become dangerous. Somewhere along the way, Columbus became possessed by a simple idea. If Asia lay to the east and the earth was round, then why not sail west? The important point is this. Educated Europeans did not need Columbus to prove the earth was round. They already knew that. Ancient Greek thinkers had argued it centuries earlier. The debate was not shape. The debate was distance. And this is where Columbus made the mistake that made history. He convinced himself, or claimed to convince himself, that Asia was much closer to Europe by sea than it really was. He chose the smaller estimates for the Earth's circumference and the larger estimates for Asia's eastern reach, bending numbers until the impossible looked merely risky. In reality, sailing west from Europe to Asia would require a voyage far longer than his ships could survive. Columbus estimated roughly 3,000 miles. The truth was closer to 4 times that, if no continent stood in the way. And that raises a question that still hangs over him. Did Columbus truly believe his own calculations, or did he know they were wrong and sell them anyway because no one funds uncertainty unless it is dressed as certainty? We do not know, but we know what happened next. He tried to sell the idea. Portugal rejected him after experts looked at his plan and saw the flaw. England did not take it. France did not take it. For years, Columbus wandered through courts, patrons, promises, and humiliations, trying to find someone willing to gamble on him. Eventually, Spain did. Not because Ferdinand and Isabella were moved by some romantic vision of discovery, but because the risk was small compared with the possible reward. 3 ships, supplies for a few months, a crew, a royal blessing. If Columbus vanished, as many sailors had vanished before him, Spain lost a manageable investment. But if he somehow reached Asia, if he somehow opened a western road to the spice trade, Spain might break the power of rival merchants and become unimaginably rich. The deal Columbus demanded was absurd. Titles, authority, a share of wealth, hereditary privileges, but those promises only mattered if he succeeded, and desperate courts make strange bargains. On April 17th, 1492, the agreement was signed. On August 3rd, only months after Granada fell and after the order expelling Jews from Spain had been issued, 3 ships left Palos before dawn. Columbus was 41 years old. He had spent years begging for this moment. He carried letters to the Great Khan of China, even though the dynasty he imagined had long since fallen. He carried maps that placed Japan roughly where the Caribbean actually lay. He carried assumptions, calculations, ambition and diseases no one aboard understood. He carried a future he did not intend, and he sailed west. The ships were small by modern imagination, but not absurdly fragile. The Santa Maria was a working cargo vessel, built for Atlantic trade, while the Nina and the Pinta were caravels, faster and more maneuverable. They were not toys. They were not miracles of recklessness. They were practical ships chosen because they could cross rough water and because the expedition was being funded with a level of economy that makes the whole thing feel less like a royal epic and more like a risky business venture. The men aboard were not simply criminals dragged from prison cells, though a few had received pardons in exchange for joining. Most were sailors, local men from the region around Palos, men who knew ships, ropes, storms, hunger, and command. The Pinzon brothers, respected captains, brought their own influence and crews. There were specialists too. A translator who knew Arabic because Columbus expected the languages of the East, someone to record valuables, men hoping for status, wages, profit, escape. They were not all fools, but they did not know what they had agreed to. Columbus told them the voyage to Japan would be manageable. His real numbers, his private hopes, and the actual geography of the planet were not the same thing. They sailed first to the Canary Islands, repaired the Pinta's rudder, took on water and food, and then, on September 6th, they left the last familiar European outpost behind and entered what they called the ocean sea. At first, the mood held. The winds were favourable, the sky was clear, the ships moved steadily west, and Columbus interpreted every advantage as divine approval. But the open ocean has a way of changing the mind. After the first days, then the first week, then the second, the men began to feel the scale of what they were doing. There was no land in any direction, no church bells, no fishing boats, no smoke from villages, only sky, water, and the endless movement of the ship beneath their feet. Imagine trying to sleep on wet wood while the hull groans around you, while bilge water stinks below, while every wave reminds you that the world you understand is now somewhere behind you, shrinking with each hour. Imagine hearing Columbus announce one distance to the crew, while privately knowing another. Imagine seeing him calm, or pretending to be calm, while you begin to wonder whether calmness is confidence or madness. Then came the seaweed. They entered the Sargasso Sea, a wide Atlantic region where currents gather floating vegetation into enormous drifting fields. To us, it has a name. To them, it must have looked like the ocean itself was changing form, becoming thick, strange, almost land-like. Seaweed wrapped around rudders. Progress slowed. The surface of the water seemed wrong. Could ships become trapped here? Could the sea turn to a swamp? Could they be stopped in the middle of nowhere, not by storm, but by something no map had warned them about? And the winds that had carried them west, the winds Columbus praised, began to frighten them for another reason. If the wind always pushed west, how would they sail east again? What if the same force that made the voyage possible made return impossible? Columbus reassured them. Winds change, God guides, land is close. But where? By late September, mutiny was no longer impossible. The crew counted days, miles, rations, and promises. The public log suggested they had already sailed the distance Columbus had said would bring them near Japan. So where was Japan? Where were the golden roofs? Where were the harbours and cities? Every day without land made Columbus look less like a visionary and more like a man gambling with other people's lives. Then signs began to appear. Birds, branches, floating plants, a carved piece of wood, the water changing. Each sign brought hope, and each sunset without land punished that hope again. The crew began seeing coastlines that were only clouds, mountains that dissolved in the light, shapes made by eyes desperate for rescue. Columbus offered rewards for whoever saw land first, and the men stared harder into the horizon, trying to turn darkness into deliverance. By October 10th, the pressure nearly broke. Martin Alonso Pinzon suggested 3 more days. If no land appeared, they would turn back. Columbus agreed, though whether he would truly have turned back is another question. By then he was too invested, too close, or too trapped by his own certainty to admit that the ocean might be bigger than his dream. On October 11th, the final day, the signs multiplied. More birds, fresh vegetation, a branch with berries still attached. The water grew lighter, as if shallows lay ahead. That night Columbus claimed he saw a flicker of light in the distance, something like a candle rising and falling. He called witnesses, but the light vanished. Was it real? Was it imagined? Was it convenient? It matters because a few hours later, at around 2 a.m. on October 12th, Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor on the Pinta, saw something that was not imagination. Land. A pale shape under the moon. A shore. A real one. He cried out, and within moments the ships were alive with men stumbling from sleep, staring toward the west. After 33 days of water, after lies, fear, prayers, threats, and near rebellion, they had found land. They lowered anchor and waited for daylight because no one was foolish enough to approach an unknown coast in the dark. The men must have felt relief before anything else. Not awe, not history. Relief. They were not going to die at sea. Whatever came next, they had reached something solid. They did not know they were anchored near an island whose people had lived there for generations. They did not know they had not reached Asia. They did not know two worlds that had developed apart for millennia were about to collide in the morning light. They only knew that the ocean had ended. But even in that moment, the pattern was already revealing itself. Columbus had promised a reward to the first man who saw land. It should have gone to Rodrigo de Triana. He was the one who shouted. The crew heard him, yet Columbus later claimed that his earlier mysterious light counted as the first sighting. The reward went to him. Think about that. Before he even stepped onto the beach, before the first flag was planted, before the first exchange of gifts, Columbus had already taken something from someone with less power and made it his own. Was it small? Maybe. But small acts can show the shape of larger ones. At dawn the island appeared. White sand, clear blue water, green trees moving in the warm wind, fish visible beneath the surface. After the cold anxiety of the Atlantic, the island must have seemed almost unreal, a soft paradise placed at the end of terror. Columbus would later describe it in language full of beauty, abundance, and wonder. But the Spanish were not alone. From the trees and from the edges of the beach, the Taíno watched. They had seen the ships approach, huge wooden structures with white sails like wings, nothing like their canoes, nothing like any craft that belonged to their world. They must have debated through the night what these things were. Spirits, enemies, visitors, traders, dead ancestors, something else entirely. Their own canoes could be large and sophisticated, some carrying dozens of people, carved from great trees and built with skill. But these European ships were made differently, assembled from many pieces, raised high from the water, carrying cloth wings and men who looked, dressed, and smelled unlike anyone they had known. Now small boats were being lowered. Men climbed down into them, pale men in layers of clothing under tropical heat. Men carrying metal, men carrying banners, men who did not understand the island, the people, the language, or even the continent they had reached. Imagine standing on that beach as a Taíno person that morning. Your family has lived in this island world for generations, used the reefs, currents, trees, storms, paths, gardens, and ceremonies. The world is not simple, but it is intelligible. Then these impossible vessels arrive out of the Eastern Sea, bringing people who violate every expectation your world has given you. What do? Run? Fight? Welcome? Wait? The leaders waited. Hospitality mattered. Curiosity mattered. Strategy mattered. These strangers might be dangerous, but they might also bring useful goods, alliances, or knowledge. Better to watch first. Better to understand before striking. Columbus came ashore wearing his best clothes, carrying the royal standard of Ferdinand and Isabella. Behind him came captains with banners marked by crosses and royal initials. They stepped through the warm water, climbed onto the sand, and performed a legal ritual in a language no one on the island understood. Columbus claimed the island for Spain. By the authority of Christian monarchs, by the logic of discovery, by a European legal imagination that recognized Christian ownership as real and non-Christian possession, as something less than ownership, the land and its people were declared part of a distant kingdom across the ocean. The Taíno had just been conquered on paper. and they had no idea. That is one of the strangest and most violent things about the moment. No battle had happened. No treaty had been understood. No agreement had been made. A man planted a flag, read words aloud, and in European eyes the island changed owners. The people who lived there did not count as owners in the way Europeans required them to count. Their relationship to land, ancestors, crops, homes, and graves was dismissed by a legal fiction sharp enough to cut continents. Imagine reversing it. Imagine a Taíno canoe somehow crossing the Atlantic, landing in Spain, placing a carved object in the ground, speaking in Arawak, and declaring Seville now belonged to the chief of Guanahani. The Spanish would have called it absurd, then probably violent. But when Europeans did it in the Caribbean, they called it law. After the ritual, the atmosphere softened, at least on the surface. Taíno people began coming out from the trees. They offered gifts, parrots, cotton thread, small objects, perhaps food, perhaps signs of peace, perhaps the beginnings of trade. The Spanish answered with glass beads and small bells, cheap things in Europe, bright and fascinating things in the Caribbean. The Taíno seemed pleased. Glass was beautiful. Bells made strange sounds. The exchange at that moment may have felt generous to both sides. But Columbus was already calculating. In his journal, he noted that these people seemed gentle, generous, and without serious weapons. He wrote that they would make good servants. He believed they could be converted easily. He observed that with 50 men they could all be subdued. He saw small gold ornaments, and understood them not as decoration, not as local meaning, not as part of another world's economy, but as signs leading to wealth. This is the terrible turn. The very qualities that made the Taíno humane in that first encounter, their openness, hospitality, trust, willingness to share, made them appear exploitable to Columbus. Their generosity became vulnerability. Their lack of iron weapons became opportunity. Their welcome became evidence that conquest would be easy. Neither side understood the other. The Spanish saw people who did not fit their categories, not Muslim, not Asian in the way they expected, not African, not Christian, not civilized according to European measures. The Taíno saw strangers who possessed astonishing metal tools and frightening weapons, but who were also helpless in basic ways, unable to read the local landscape, unable to identify foods, unable to move properly through the island world without guidance. The strangers were powerful and ignorant at the same time. Columbus thought he was near Asia, beginning contact with subjects or neighbours of the Great Khan. The Taíno likely thought they were receiving strange visitors who would trade and then leave. Both were catastrophically wrong. This was not a brief encounter. It was not the beginning of equal exchange. It was the first point of contact in a process that would destroy most of the Taíno world within generations and transform the planet. But on that first morning, with sunlight on the water, flags in the sand, parrots changing hands for beads, and people smiling without understanding one another's words, it may have looked peaceful, and that is what makes it so haunting. Before we follow Columbus farther, we need to pause and see what was actually there, because the Caribbean was not empty, not primitive, not a stage waiting for Europeans to enter. It was home to the Taíno, a people whose name is often understood as meaning good or noble, and who had created a complex island civilization across the Caribbean, stretching through places we now call Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and beyond. They were not isolated little groups trapped on separate islands. They were seafarers. They built canoes from enormous sacred trees, using fire and stone tools in a process that required patience, skill, and collective effort. Some canoes could carry large numbers of people across open water, and the Taíno used them constantly. Trade goods moved across hundreds of miles. Stone from one island appeared on another. Shell ornaments travelled. Pottery styles spread, changed, and returned in new forms. Marriage alliances linked communities cross water. Kinship networks helped people survive hurricanes, crop failures, conflict, and famine. If one island suffered, relatives elsewhere might help. This was not weakness. It was adaptation. The Taíno had engineered a way of living across islands that made sense in the Caribbean, a world of storms, reefs, soil differences, and seasonal uncertainty. Columbus saw little clothing and no iron, and he mistook that for simplicity. But simplicity is not the same as primitiveness, and technology is not measured only by metal. Their agriculture was sophisticated. Cassava, or yucca, was a central crop, resilient and productive, but also naturally toxic if prepared incorrectly. The Taíno developed processing methods to grate the root, press out poison through woven strainers, dry the flour and bake it into cassava bread that could last for months. Think about that for a moment. This is not accidental survival. This is scientific knowledge carried through generations, refined by experiment, memory, and necessity. They grew sweet potatoes, beans, peppers, peanuts, pineapples, and other crops. They planted in mounds called canucos, improving drainage and creating small ecological zones that supported multiple plants. Modern people might call some of this permaculture, sustainable agriculture, environmental management. The Taíno simply knew how to live where they lived. They also made art. Stone, shell, wood, bone, and cotton became ceremonial objects, ornaments, tools, and spiritual forms. Their zimi objects represented gods, ancestors, and powers that moved through the world. For the Taíno, reality was not divided cleanly between visible and invisible. Spirits inhabited trees, rivers, caves, storms, and ancestors. Leaders consulted sacred objects before decisions. Rituals joined politics, memory, and spiritual authority. Their society had hierarchy, but not in the same way Spain did. Caciques, or chiefs, led villages and regional alliances, but their authority depended on generosity, success, spiritual power, and the ability to protect and feed people. Women could hold important roles, including spiritual ones, and in some cases could become leaders themselves, something that would have unsettled European assumptions if Europeans had bothered to understand it. The Taíno had creation stories, afterlife beliefs, ceremonial plazas, ball games, craft specialists, political rivalries, jokes, songs, grief, love, and history. They were not one flat group called Indians. They were people with internal differences, ambitions, fears, knowledge, and memory. They argued, they mourned, they raised children, they built, they prayed, they laughed, they worried about storms, they planned marriages, they remembered ancestors. They were not waiting to be discovered. They were already there, and within a few decades most of them would be dead. Their languages would be pushed towards silence. Their oral histories would fracture. Their ecological knowledge, built over centuries, would be dismissed or lost. But on October 12th, 1492, none of that had happened yet. The people of Guanahani saw strangers and responded with curiosity and hospitality. They behaved like civilized people receiving visitors. Columbus saw all of this and understood almost nothing. He did not stay long on the first island because the island did not give him what he needed. It gave him beauty, people, food, welcome, and small ornaments, but not the enormous gold he had promised Spain. Those tiny gold pieces became clues in his mind, breadcrumbs leading toward the treasure that had to exist somewhere nearby. He asked, through gestures and confusion, where the gold came from. The Taíno pointed toward other islands, perhaps meaning Cuba, perhaps trying to answer, perhaps trying to send him away. Columbus heard what he wanted. Cuba became, in his imagination, Chipangu, Japan, the golden island described by Marco Polo. It did not matter that the villages looked nothing like the wealthy Asian courts he expected. It did not matter that the people did not match his books. His promise required Asia, and so his mind forced the Caribbean into Asian shapes. Only 2 days after the first landing, he moved on. He took Taíno men with him as guides and interpreters. Historical writing often says he took them as if the phrase is harmless. But these were people with homes, families, obligations, and names. They were not maps. They were not tools. They were seized because Columbus needed them. And once again, the pattern sharpened. Arrive, claim, rename, take, move on. For the next weeks, Columbus sailed through the Bahamas, naming islands with Christian and royal names that meant nothing to the people already living there. Every island was beautiful. Every island had people. Every island failed to provide enough gold. The Taíno guides kept pointing west or south toward larger lands, perhaps telling the truth, perhaps giving the strangers what they seemed desperate to hear, perhaps simply hoping the bearded men would leave their home islands alone. On October 28th, Columbus reached Cuba. Cuba unsettled him because it was large. As his ships followed its coast and the land kept extending, it seemed too big to be just another island. Columbus convinced himself he'd reached the mainland of Asia, the coast of China. He sent men inland to find cities, officials of the Khan, markets, silk, gold, proof. They found Taíno villages, tobacco, cultivated fields, organized communities, but no Chinese cities, no palaces, no imperial court, no evidence of Asia. Columbus wrote as if the evidence would come soon. This is one of the most revealing things about him. He was not simply observing reality. He was negotiating with it. He described the land that existed, its harbours, forests, people, and climate, while also insisting it must be the land his theory required. He was describing two places at once, the Caribbean before his eyes and Asia inside his head. And whenever those two places contradicted each other, the one inside his head usually won. By early December, he reached Hispaniola, the island that would become the centre of Spain's first violent colonizing efforts in the Americas. Here there was more gold, not enough to match fantasy, not enough for the palaces of Asia, but enough to restore Columbus's hope. Gold dust, small ornaments, hints of rivers and mines, enough to take back to Spain as proof that the voyage had not been a mistake. His tone changed. His confidence returned. The land was fertile. The people were numerous. The mountains surely held more. The rivers surely carried more. The gold, he believed, was always just beyond the next place. But now the relationship darkened. Columbus asked more insistently. His men moved farther inland. The captives from other islands remained unable to return home. And in his journals, Columbus wrote openly about how easy it would be to conquer these people, how small a Spanish force could control the island. The voyage had begun as a search for a route. It was becoming a plan for possession. Then came Christmas Eve, 1492. After weeks exploring the northern coast of Hispaniola, Columbus, exhausted, did something careless. He went to sleep and left the helm of the Santa Maria in the hands of a cabin boy. In calm water, without a storm, without a dramatic act of God, The flagship drifted onto a coral reef. Wood ground against stone in the dark. By morning, the ship that had carried Columbus across the Atlantic was ruined. A lesser storyteller might call this disaster. Columbus called it providence. The Taíno helped salvage the cargo. They paddled in canoes, helped remove goods, tools, weapons, and supplies. The Spanish stripped beams and planks from the wreck. The Santa Maria, symbol of the crossing, became lumber. From its bones, Columbus ordered a fort built on the coast of Hispaniola. They called it La Navidad, the Nativity, the birth. But what was being born? Not a city, not yet. A rough palisade, a few buildings, storage, a place for weapons and goods, a European foothold made from a broken ship, surrounded by Taíno communities that had not asked for it and did not need it. Columbus could not take everyone home. The Santa Maria was gone. Space was limited. So he left 39 men behind. 39. There is something chilling about the exactness of that number. 39 men left in a place they barely understood, among people they had already begun to underestimate, with promises of gold, instructions to behave peacefully, and the intoxicating knowledge that they had steel, weapons, and distance from direct authority. Columbus told them to obey their leaders, respect the Taíno, avoid trouble, and search for gold. But instructions written in the language of discipline rarely survive the desires of armed men who believe a land is theirs to take. He gave gifts to the local chief Guacanagari, whose people had helped rescue the wrecked crew, and Columbus saw in him a potential ally, a local ruler who might become useful to Spain. Then Columbus sailed away. Imagine the silence after the Niña and Pinta disappeared eastward. The rough wooden fort creaking in the sun, the island air heavy with insects and salt. 39 Europeans standing inside a world that seemed friendly but was not theirs, among people whose patience had limits they did not understand. Back on the ships, Columbus was already turning the accident into a story. La Navidad would not be described as a desperate improvisation after a wreck, but as a deliberate foundation, the first Christian foothold beyond the Western Sea. The Taíno would be described as gentle, generous, easy to convert. The land would be described as rich, fertile, ready. He could not describe what happened after he left, because no European account survived from inside those walls. So we have fragments. What likely happened? Start with pressure. 39 men, most of them young, armed, ambitious and unsupervised, surrounded by communities whose food, women and ornaments they increasingly desired. Some Spanish accounts suggest the men ignored orders, left the fort, split into groups, demanded gold, seized women, took food, and pushed into neighbouring territories. Taíno hospitality at first may have absorbed some of this, but hospitality is not surrender. The Taíno had politics of their own. Chiefs had rivals. Alliances mattered. If one leader tolerated the strangers, another might see danger. And if Spanish behaviour became abusive, then destroying the outpost might not have looked like rebellion to the Taíno. It might have looked like restoring order. Disease may have moved too. Even a few sick sailors could have carried infections into communities with no prior exposure. Or perhaps disease struck the Spaniards themselves. Internal conflict among the 39 is also likely. No women, no clear structure, no immediate gold, no path home except Columbus's return. Factions could form quickly. Violence could turn inward before anyone outside attacked. La Navidad was not a peaceful seed of civilization. It was a pressure chamber. When Columbus returned in late 1493 with a second expedition, 17 ships this time, Hundreds of men, animals, seeds, tools, priests, weapons and plans. La Navidad was silent. The fort was burned. The men were gone. No cheers, no gold, no thriving colony, just ruins. Guacanagari said another Taíno leader had attacked and that he had tried to help. He showed wounds. Was he telling the truth? Part of the truth? A version designed to protect himself? We do not know. Were the Spaniards killed in one attack, hunted in small groups, weakened by disease, divided by internal violence? We do not know. And that uncertainty gives La Navidad its dark power. The first European settlement in the Americas did not fall because the land was empty or too savage or too harsh. It fell in the middle of a living society that reacted to armed strangers in its own way. Its failure shaped everything that followed. When Columbus built again, he built with more force, more walls, more control, and far more violence. The little fort made from the bones of the Santa Maria burned, and with it burned one possible path between worlds. What came after was darker. But before that second fleet returned, Columbus had to survive the voyage home. And the ocean, which had carried him west with strange kindness, now seemed to remember its true nature. In January 1493 he left the Caribbean in the Niña, with the Pinta damaged and separated at times, and sailed east into winter. Picture the North Atlantic without forecasts, without engines, without anyone fully understanding the scale of the water beneath them. Clouds thickening like iron, wind rising, waves climbing higher than the ships, rain and foam erasing the horizon, men vomiting, praying, tying themselves to the vessel so they would not be thrown into the dark. The Pinta disappeared in the storm. The Niña groaned as if the sea were trying to pull every plank apart. And Columbus realized something brutal. If he died here, the story might die with him. No Spain, no court, no proof, no titles, no claim, only distant islands and people who might remember strange visitors who came from the east and vanished. So in the middle of the storm, Columbus wrote. He wrote letters describing the lands, the people, the gold, the promise. He sealed some accounts in barrels and threw them into the ocean, hoping that if the ship sank, perhaps his words would wash ashore somewhere and preserve his achievement. It was not simply fear, it was legacy management in the face of death. He survived. The Niña reached the Azores, then Portugal, then Spain. The Pinta survived too, arriving separately. The ocean failed to erase him. And once Columbus reached Europe, the story began to transform almost immediately. His letters spread quickly, copied, translated, printed, passed through cities like early modern viral material. People who had never crossed the sea read about green islands, warm air, generous naked people, gold, fertile land, and souls waiting for Christianity. The letter was not neutral. It was report, advertisement, justification, and sales pitch. Columbus described the Taíno as easy to command, lacking iron, horses, and serious weapons. He described the land as abundant. He insisted he had reached the Indies, still clinging to Asia. But in European imagination, something else formed. A world newly available, not new to itself, new to European hunger. When Columbus appeared before Ferdinand and Isabella in Barcelona, he did not come empty-handed. He brought parrots, cotton, ornaments, bits of gold, strange plants, and most dramatically Taíno captives. These men, removed from their islands and displayed in Europe, became living evidence. To many watching, they were marvels. To the monarchy, proof. To priests, souls. To courtiers, signs of opportunity. The cruelty of their abduction was almost invisible in those who saw only wonder. Columbus knelt before the monarchs and described what he had found, still placing it at the edge of Asia, still promising more. More islands, more converts, more gold, more reason for Spain to act quickly before Portugal or another rival power could challenge its claim. And empires do not run on wonder alone. They need documents, blessings, legal fictions, permission written in ink. So Rome entered the story. Pope Alexander VI issued papal bulls in 1493 granting Spain broad rights over lands west of a certain line, provided Spain Christianized the people there. Portugal objected. Negotiations followed. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas drew another line, dividing non-European worlds between Spain and Portugal, with maps that were mostly guesses. Think about the arrogance of that. Two European kingdoms, supported by church authority, dividing continents they had barely seen, among peoples they did not know existed in their full complexity, with languages, nations, laws, ancestors, gods, and territories of their own. But to Spain and Portugal, this looked like order. To them, ink made conquest legitimate. To the Taíno, none of this paperwork mattered, but the ships that paperwork justified were already being prepared. The second voyage was not 3 nervous vessels slipping across a mystery. It was a fleet, 17 ships, more than 1,000 men, horses, pigs, cattle, seeds, tools, priests, soldiers, craftsmen, administrators, colonists, and chains. The goal was no longer to see what lay across the sea. The goal was to occupy it. And inside those ships moved something no royal document mentioned clearly enough: biology. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic, he did not simply move people, flags, and ambition. He joined 2 biological worlds that had been separated for thousands of years. Plants, animals, germs, insects, weeds, and human bodies began to cross in both directions. Historians call it the Columbian Exchange, but that phrase can sound too tidy, almost polite. It was not polite. It was a planetary collision. For more than 10,000 years, the Americas had developed with their own crops, animals, and diseases. Europe, Africa, and Asia had developed with theirs. When ships began to cross regularly, these systems slammed together. The deadliest movement was disease. In the old world, humans had lived for millennia alongside domesticated animals such as cattle, pigs, goats, chickens, sheep, and horses, often in crowded towns where waste, animals, and people mixed constantly. Diseases jumped species, spread through cities, killed children, burned through populations, and left survivors with partial resistance. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, whooping cough. These were not new horrors to Europe. They were old killers. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had illnesses of their own, but not these, not with the same long history of Eurasian animal domestication and dense urban transmission. When smallpox and measles arrived, many communities faced enemies their bodies had never been trained to recognize. The results were catastrophic. We cannot know the exact numbers, but in many regions, indigenous populations collapsed by 70, 80, even 90% within generations. Sometimes disease moved ahead of Europeans, traveling along trade networks from village to village, carried by people who had never seen a Spanish face. A coastal community might fall sick, and then the sickness moved inland, faster than conquest, faster than rumour. Imagine a world where elders die in weeks, where children vanish from households, where healers cannot explain what they are seeing, where leaders disappear, where planting, ceremony, defence, memory and food systems all collapse together. The Spanish brought violence, yes, and slavery, forced labour, terror, hunger and war. but in many places disease did a level of killing that swords alone could never have accomplished. Yet the exchange was not only death moving west, life moved too, though unequally. From the Americas came crops that would reshape the world: potatoes, tomatoes, maize, cacao, chili peppers, peanuts, cassava, and more. Before 1492, no Italian cook had seen a tomato, no Irish farmer had planted a potato, no West African village had maize, no European child had tasted chocolate as we know it. Within centuries, these foods were everywhere. The potato, born in the Andes, packed calories into poor soils and cold climates, helping European populations grow. The tomato, once distrusted in Europe, eventually transformed Mediterranean cooking so completely that people now imagine Italian cuisine as if it had always been red with tomato sauce. Maize spread through Europe, Africa, and Asia, feeding regions where other grains struggled. Cacao crossed the ocean and changed from sacred Mesoamerican drink to European luxury and then global obsession. Your kitchen is a museum of 1492, but the movement westward carried animals and crops that transformed the Americas just as dramatically. Horses, cattle, pigs, goats, sheep, wheat, barley, sugarcane. Pigs rooted through forests and gardens, multiplied rapidly, and disrupted local ecologies. Horses, extinct in the Americas since the end of the last ice age, returned with the Spanish and eventually transformed indigenous life far beyond the Caribbean, especially in the plains of North America. European crops required land clearing. Weeds came accidentally. Sugarcane grew brutally well in the Caribbean, and European demand for sugar would help create plantation systems that dragged millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic in chains. So when we speak of Columbus's voyages, we must remember the ships carried more than men. They carried a biological future, and no one standing on the beach in 1492, Spanish or Taíno, could see it. They could see faces, feathers, flags, beads, and weapons. They could not see viruses waiting in breath, seeds waiting in barrels, animals waiting below deck, sugar waiting to become an empire of suffering. Biology had entered the story, and it was about to rewrite it. When Columbus returned to the Caribbean in 1493, the ocean was no longer empty behind him. 17 ships crowded the horizon. This was not exploration with uncertainty at its centre. This was colonization with plans, demands, and expectations. The men aboard had heard stories of gold and easy peoples. Some imagined wealth. Some imagined estates. Some imagined spiritual glory. Some, especially those formed by Spain's wars, probably imagined forts, tribute, punishment, and command. They expected La Navidad. They found ruin. The destroyed fort hardened everything. To Columbus and his men, it looked like treachery, rebellion, proof that kindness had been misplaced. To the Taíno, it may have been justice against violent intruders. But Spanish interpretation mattered because Spanish ships now carried overwhelming force. Near the ruins, Columbus founded a new settlement, La Isabela, named for the Queen. This one was larger, more formal, and from the beginning more coercive. Storehouses, church, walls, authority, and eventually gallows. The language of friendship was giving way to the language of tribute. Columbus needed results. Spain wanted profit. His men wanted rewards. Gold remained scarce. Food shortages appeared quickly. La Isabela was poorly placed, with bad water, disease, and hunger weakening the colonists. Disappointment turned dangerous. Men who had expected riches muttered that Columbus had lied. Some raided Taíno villages for food and women. the colony began to rot from within and lash outward. The solution Columbus and the Spanish increasingly reached for was forced labour. The system that emerged, known as encomienda, wore a legal and religious mask. Spaniards were entrusted with indigenous communities, supposedly to protect them and teach Christianity. In return, they could demand labour and tribute. In reality, it was organised exploitation. Taíno men were forced to search rivers for gold. Women were made to carry water, produce food, serve households, and endure abuses the records often soften. Children were pulled into labour. Communities that had once worked to sustain themselves now worked to satisfy demands from strangers. In some areas, people were ordered to bring fixed quantities of gold. Those who met quotas might receive tokens showing compliance. Those who failed could face brutal punishment. Later critics such as Bartolomé de las Casas described mutilations, hands cut off, bodies used as warnings, villages burned. Even if any single account is debated, the pattern is not. Terror was used to extract labour from people already being weakened by disease, hunger, displacement, and grief. Resistance followed. Taíno leaders who had once tried to welcome, negotiate, or contain the Spanish saw the pattern. More ships, more demands, more violence, more people taken. Around 1495, a major coalition rose against the invaders in Hispaniola. The numbers in the sources vary, but the meaning is clear. This was not a minor incident. It was an attempt to push back. It failed. Spanish steel, crossbows, horses, and war dogs gave them a terrifying advantage. Horses especially must have seemed monstrous to fighters who had never seen such animals. Afterward, captives were taken. Some were enslaved locally. Others were shipped to Spain and sold. This was one of the early waves of mass indigenous enslavement under Spanish rule, and it would not be the last. At the same time, disease moved quietly through Taíno communities. The Spanish did not fully understand what they carried. The Taíno could only see that after the strangers came, new kinds of death came too. Villages lost elders, workers, children, leaders. The structure of life frayed. Some historians debate terms. They ask whether genocide is the right word for this early period, noting that the Spanish crown sometimes issued laws intended to limit abuses. But on the ground, when deliberate violence, forced labour, enslavement, terror and indifference to survival combine with epidemic collapse, the distinction can feel painfully academic. For the Taíno, the world was ending in stages. Columbus, meanwhile, proved far better at demanding titles than governing human beings. His own colonists complained that he and his brothers were tyrannical, incompetent, unfair, too harsh, not harsh enough, unable to produce enough gold, unable to control the colony. Spain began to worry. Prestige had been invested. Authority had to be restored. In 1500, the crown sent Francisco de Bobadilla with broad powers. He arrived in Hispaniola, investigated complaints, saw prisons, disorder, punishments, and accusations of brutality, and concluded that Columbus was at the centre of a failing colony. He arrested Columbus and his brothers. The admiral of the ocean sea, the man received as a hero only years earlier, was placed in chains and sent back to Spain. There is something almost theatrical about that reversal, but it was real. Columbus crossed eastward in irons. Later stories say he refused to have the chains removed, even when offered, and kept them as a symbol of his betrayal. Whether every detail is true or not, the image endures because it captures the collapse of the myth inside the man's own lifetime. To Europe, Columbus could still be the visionary who opened Western lands. To many in the Caribbean, he was the beginning of hunger, violence, forced labour, and death. By 1500, the paradise he'd described was already being remade. Forests were cleared, villages disrupted. People moved, enslaved, baptized, punished, and buried. The first encounter that began with gifts and curiosity had become conquest with swords and chains. And for the Taíno, time was running out. By the end of his life, Columbus still did not understand the world he had collided with. In 1506, old, ill, disappointed, and still fighting for the titles and profits he believed he was owed, he died in Spain, convinced that the lands he had reached were part of Asia. He had seen islands, peoples, plants, and distances that did not fit his expectations. But rather than abandon the map in his head, he bent everything he saw around it. He died inside his mistake. And for a while, history did not make him the grand hero we now imagine. Other names rose. Amerigo Vespucci, whose writings helped convince Europe these lands were not Asia. Cortés and Pizarro, whose conquest brought Spain the gold and silver Columbus had only dreamed about. Mapmakers began writing America. Empires grew. Columbus became one explorer among many. Important, yes, but not yet the marble figure pointing west across schoolbooks and statues. That transformation came later. In the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in the United States, Columbus became useful as myth. A young nation that had broken from Britain wanted founding symbols that were not British. Columbus, an Italian sailing for Spain, could be reshaped into a figure of boldness, risk, and new beginnings. Writers and politicians turned him into a visionary. Schoolbooks falsely taught that he proved the earth was round. Paintings showed him stepping nobly onto untouched shores. Cities, districts, rivers, and institutions took his name. The complicated man became a statue. The arrests faded. The cruelty faded. The misrule faded. The Taíno faded most of all, pushed into the background as vague figures receiving history rather than making it. But indigenous peoples did not forget. For many communities across the Americas, 1492 is not the beginning of discovery. It is the beginning of invasion. Disease, forced conversion, enslavement, land seizure, cultural destruction, and displacement begin or intensify from that moment. For the Taíno, long declared extinct by many historians, survival is more complicated. Genetic evidence, language, foodways, family memory, place names, and cultural practices across the Caribbean show that the story did not end in total disappearance. Many people today reclaim Taíno heritage not as fantasy, but as continuity. The message is simple and powerful. We did not vanish. Across the Americas, indigenous survival took many forms. Languages protected in secret, ceremonies carried quietly through generations, agricultural knowledge preserved, sacred places remembered, stories told beneath the noise of empire. In the 20th and 21st centuries, those memories grew louder. Statues were challenged. Columbus Day was questioned. Indigenous Peoples' Day emerged in many places as an alternative or companion commemoration. The controversy is emotionally complex. For many Italian Americans, Columbus Day became a symbol of dignity in a country that once discriminated against them, a way to claim belonging through an Italian figure linked to the Americas. For many indigenous people, the same holiday feels like celebrating the day catastrophe entered the family story. Those truths collide because public memory is never just about the past. It is about who gets honoured, who gets erased, and whose pain is considered too inconvenient for a parade. Different places remember October 12th differently. In Spain, it is tied to national identity and the Spanish-speaking world. In Latin America, the names and meanings vary. Encounter, race, resistance, mixture, conquest. In the Caribbean, it is inseparable from Taíno loss, African slavery, sugar plantations, and later revolutions. Historians keep revising the picture as archaeology, genetics, and environmental studies add new evidence. Taíno villages appear more complex than older narratives admitted. Artifacts shift timelines. Isotopes reveal movement. DNA shows mixture earlier than expected. Columbus's own logs are reread, and old certainties weaken. History changes not because the past changes, but because the questions do. And maybe that is the only honest way to hold 1492. Not as a clean monument, not as a simple villain story, not as a heroic painting, but as a collision full of skill, delusion, courage, greed, wonder, theft, disease, survival, and consequences nobody on those ships or beaches could have imagined. Columbus was a skilled navigator and a disastrous governor. He was brave at sea and blind on land. He crossed an ocean and misunderstood what he found. The Taíno were victims of violence and disease, but they were also complex people, makers of a world, ancestors of living communities, not shadows waiting at the edge of someone else's story. 1492 was the beginning of global connection, and it was also the beginning of immense suffering. Both are true, and as you drift closer to sleep, you might return to those first nights after landfall. Imagine the Taíno speaking around fires about the strange ships and pale visitors. Imagine Columbus writing by lantern light, convinced he stands near Asia. Imagine sailors touching sand with trembling relief. Imagine a child watching sails on the horizon, not knowing that the world has already changed. The waves that rocked those ships are gone. The men are gone. The first footprints in the sand have disappeared. But the ripples are still moving through our foods, our languages, our borders, our holidays, our arguments, and our dreams. One voyage, 3 ships, a few dozen men, and from that collision came empires, epidemics, plantations, revolutions, new cuisines, new populations, new identities, and old wounds that never fully closed. On one side of the ocean stood a Europe hungry for spices, gold, land, and salvation. On the other stood the Taíno and countless other peoples living in worlds complete, long before Columbus saw a shoreline under the moon. 2 realities met, and neither side truly understood what the meeting meant. When we look backward, it is easy to speak in large phrases: the age of exploration, the rise of Europe, the fall of Indigenous America, the birth of the modern world. But beneath those phrases were people waking up each morning without knowing they were history. A sailor afraid the wind would never turn. A chief deciding whether strangers should be welcomed. A Taíno mother watching unfamiliar men approach the beach. A captive taken onto a ship and carried toward a world he never chose. A king and queen reading reports of gold. A sick child in a village where no one yet knows what smallpox is. History is not only dates, it is breath, hunger, misunderstanding, hope, violence, silence, the sound of waves against a hull the night before everything changes. So you do not have to decide tonight whether Columbus was a hero, a villain, or something more difficult. You can let the complexity remain. You can hold the world before contact, the world after contact, and that narrow, fragile moment between them when people crossed from one era into another without knowing it. And if you're still awake, and this journey through the dark waters of 1492 has carried you somewhere, you can gently tap like or subscribe, so more long, calm histories can find you on other nights. You can leave a quiet comment telling us where in the world you're listening from, whether it's a small room in Madrid, An apartment in Cairo, a dorm in Sao Paulo, a sofa far from the Atlantic, or somewhere else entirely, with old oceans moving softly in the background. But for now, you do not need to do anything. Let the story fade like a ship shrinking into the horizon. Let the lanterns dim. Let the voices on deck grow softer. Let the Caribbean night settle over the beach, over the trees, over the anchored ships, over the people who do not yet know what morning will bring. The sails loosen, the waves slow, the islands grow quiet, and you can drift off with history